Change your world. What a noble calling. Fantastic ideal. But is it possible? More importantly, is it possible for someone like me? I think all of us live with this tension between two voices that speak inside our heads. There's one voice that tells us that essentially we're irrelevant, we're insignificant. There's nothing special or ordinary about me. I'm just one of the plain guys. Then there's another voice that tells us, yes, while our life and experience might seem ordinary, that there's actually something unique, something valuable inside of me just waiting to be discovered and unleashed. And I wonder which of those voices brings you the most fear. The fear that there's no potential in you, or the possibility that there is, but you're not living up to it. What is it we could do? What is it that we could achieve if we could live without fear in 2023? What God-given potential could be released if we could overcome our fears of failure, what other people think of us, of our discomfort, of not getting our own way, and actually embrace the calling of God that has been uniquely fashioned for you, for each one of us, knowing that He can do extraordinary things through ordinary people just like you. In 1974, 346 people died when Turkish Airlines Flight 981 crashed in a ball of flames over France. Why? The cargo door didn't shut quite right. Wasn't a big thing, but just enough to bring down a jet. 346 lives lost because of one pin. One pin would have made the difference. One. Thomas Jefferson was elected third president of the USA by one vote. One vote can make a difference. One word can really make a difference. You passed. You're hired. I'm sorry. You're forgiven. Your medical results are back and they are negative. A name can make a difference too. A nickname can either make you or scar you for the rest of your life. Abraham Lincoln prevailed against the injustices of slavery and saved a nation. Martin Luther saw corruption in the church, nailed his 95 objections to a door in Wittenberg, changed the course of European history. One man healed by Jesus begins to tell his story in the Decapolis, and 4,000 people come to hear Jesus speak the next time. One man, one woman can make a difference. It's the power of one. It's the power of you to impact the world around you in this new year. But the power of you always begins with a choice. You cannot make a difference in the world without first making a decision. And for believers, the decision that we are asked to make is simply this: what part do you want to play in God's plan of bringing His kingdom into this world? That's right, you get to choose. It's your call. The beauty of choosing to be part of God's story and His kingdom coming into this world is that everything is set in place. The script has already been written. For those of us who have read the story, we know how it ends. We've read the last chapter. We find that God wins. It doesn't matter what man does, God's purposes will be established. Think of these words from Daniel 11. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. In Mark 14, Jesus says, the scriptures must be fulfilled. In Hebrews 4, his work has been finished since the creation of the world. God's plans have been set from the time of creation, from the foundation of the world. Paul tells us here in Romans that even the story of redemption has been mapped out from beginning to end since the beginning of time. God's plans are set. What's not set is what part you want to play in it all. Do you want to play a big part, small part, a mediocre part, or zero part? It's really up to you. God has chosen us to be part of his plan. You get to choose whether you embrace that or not. We're the ones that decide in the end. Because you see, if we were all vaporized today, God's plan would still be achieved, wouldn't it? But God is gracious. He's good. He says, listen, church, I'm giving you the privilege of being involved in this. I'm giving you first choice in making a contribution. I wanted to look this morning at how this played out in the lives of some Bible characters. Stories in which we see our own reflections of our fears, the difficult choices we are sometimes asked to make in order to impact this world, but ultimately a picture of the profound sense of purpose that comes from embracing our mission. For in every believer's life, there's going to come a time when we are asked to choose to step into a moment and act. Defining moments that can shape our destinies or not, our epitaphs or not, our hopes and dreams for living lives of significance and purpose or not. And we have to be careful not to miss those moments, for sometimes those kinds of opportunities only come along once. Let's start with Jeremiah. Jeremiah says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Sovereign Lord, I said, I don't know how to speak. I'm just a child. But the Lord said to me, do not say, I am only a child. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. God tells Jeremiah that he knows each of us before we are born. He forms not just our bodies, but the purposes for which we will be called later in life. There is a calling, a mission which is uniquely yours, which is uniquely mine, and they will be as varied as the people that God creates. But one thing we all have in common is that our lives are really just little missions. And Jeremiah resists this because of feelings of inadequacy, or perhaps it's just plain fear. But God doesn't accept Jeremiah's assessment of the situation, and with some frustration, God compels him to step up and embrace his calling. Jeremiah's experiences are not unique, of course, to him alone. We see this much earlier in the Bible in the life of Moses. In his story, we see again all of the excuses that we're prone to make. and God's frustration with those of us who resist their calling in life. We see all of that at the burning bush. Moses here throws every excuse possible at God not to embrace his calling. And we're told in this passage that God's anger burns against him. Wow, that's surprising. Aren't we told that God is very slow to anger? When we think of God's wrath, we usually think of his anger at sin. But anger is also, it seems, directed at those who don't see and turn their back on the life that he is calling them to. Ironically, this is what we learn about Moses in the book of Acts. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Get this. He was powerful in speech and action. Well, isn't that the exact opposite of what he was trying to say to God at the burning bush? Don't send me, I can't speak, I trip over my tongue, I'm not the right person. Moses was powerful in speech and action. What's going on there? Is it possible that God's anger at Moses is because he knows the truth about Moses and what he's capable of, but Moses is refusing to acknowledge it? What would Moses have missed out on if he had not responded to the call of God on his life? What a ride. What an adventure he would have missed. We find this idea repeated again in Judges chapter 4. It's the story of Deborah and Barak. Barak was one of the military commanders at the time. Deborah was a prophetess, but she was also ruling Israel at the time as well. Deborah calls Barak in one day, and she says to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men to Naphtali and Zebulun and lead the way to Mount Tabor." God says, "I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the river, and there I will give him into your hands." So God is basically saying, I want you to go to such and such a place, and there I'm going to deliver your enemy into your hands. Let's see the outcome. In reply, Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Very well," Deborah said, "I will go with you, but because of the way you are going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to me, a woman." This was supposed to be Barak's moment of honor, but he refused to step into that moment. Sometimes the blessing that was meant to be ours eludes us because we don't have the courage to step up and meet the need that God has uniquely equipped us to meet. It's a tragedy that we don't respond to the fact that God created you to live an original life. There's a path that God wants you to take. Only your footsteps are supposed to tread there. Think of Barak, think of Moses, all saying the same thing. Please send somebody else. If you don't rise up and do what you're called to do, God is going to let someone else do it because it needs to be done. I wonder how many times in our life have we been like Barak, who simply didn't have the courage to do what God was calling him to do. One more example, the story of Esther. Jewish nation, as you know, is under threat. Esther seems to be the only one in a position to do something about it. Mordecai pleads with her to intervene on behalf of her people, but Esther says, "I'll die. I can't do this." She's initially paralyzed by fear. Mordecai says to her, Do not think, Esther, that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, the release of the Jews will arrive from another place. God will get the job done. He doesn't necessarily need you, is what he says to all of us. Release from the Jews will arrive from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. God's purposes are always achieved, whether they're through you or someone else. And then Mordecai's fabulous words, who knows but that you have come to a royal position for just such a time as this. In other words, you have a mission, Esther, and your mission matters. And you have been brought to this point in your life, not for yourself, but to be part of God's plan to redeem the world and to spare people a great suffering. It's your choice, Esther, and Esther chooses. And a nation is saved. These stories all have something in common. They have crisis. Let's not ever be afraid of crisis, because God's call is often birthed out of crisis. In the midst of tragedy. We're often tempted to think God is actually absent during those times, but it may very well be the circumstances through which he plans to move your life forward. The other things these stories have in common is fear. It's okay to be afraid. Surprise. We didn't see it coming. Excuses. Feelings of inadequacy. Hesitation. But the main thing that connects all of those stories that I've referred to this morning, the main thing that connects them is that a decision had to be made. And now it's our day. Now it's our turn. God is still in the mission-giving business, and he's looking for people like you and me to decide to be part of his story of bringing his kingdom into the world in this generation. So, the practical part of my message this morning, how do I become part of God's story? How do I know when I am being called and what my mission is? And those are all great questions, but in all truth, the answer is I don't know what yours is. I can only ever really know my own. But there are some practices that we can all implement that make it possible for God to speak to us. Practices that ensure that when God speaks, you're likely to recognize his voice. What are some things you can do to be in a position where you're able to respond? Well, before we get to some of those, the first word of advice is to maintain perspective when you feel overwhelmed by the state of the world or your capacity to make a difference. Well, I think we need to start there because we all share that same feelings of being overwhelmed when you look at all of the things that just need to be done, need to be changed in our world, can often be very discouraging, and you lose sight of where to actually start. Maintaining perspective, the classic example of that is those who built these magnificent cathedrals centuries ago. These cathedrals that dot the landscape of England and Europe. In most cases, the building of these cathedrals went on for several generations, some as much as 150 years in the making. How would you like to buy a house and land package where you're told it'll be 150 years, but you're going to love it? Given that the average age of some of the workers was 40, if you got to 40, you were doing pretty well in those days. Those who drew up the plans, those who built the foundation, those who built the walls would have done so with the realization that they would never live to see the final masterpiece. And that's exactly what happened. Do we have their kind of vision that thought in terms of hundreds of years rather than hundreds of days? Yes, your contribution may only be small, But in God's overall plan, he meant the world to be a better place because of it. You might just be only one piece in the jigsaw, but the jigsaw would be incomplete nonetheless, even ugly, without your piece. So when it comes to feeling overwhelmed by the state of the world and all the horror that we see as we open our newspapers, I'd encourage you to keep these words of Mother Teresa's in mind. Prayer in action is love, and love in action is service. Try to give unconditionally whatever a person needs in the moment. The point is to do something, however small, and show your care through your actions by giving your time. We are all God's children, so it is important to share his gifts. Do not worry about why problems exist in the world. Just respond to people's needs. We feel what we are doing is just a drop in the ocean, but that ocean would be less without that drop. So, some practical advice. What can you do? First and foremost, know your strengths and serve out of those strengths. Do you know what they are? Could you write down on a piece of paper what you believe your strengths as a person to be? For some reason, we've come to believe that we serve God best when we serve out of areas where we are weak. That is not true. Research has shown this time and time again. Though nothing is impossible to God and he can use your weaknesses when he needs to, God, on the other hand, deliberately, intentionally equipped us with strengths, and research has shown again and again we are most effective and influential when we serve out of those strengths and become even better and stronger at doing it. So know what your strengths are. There's all sorts of surveys. If you're not sure of what your spiritual gifts are, or even what the strengths of your personality type are, there's plenty of these kinds of tests that can give you some very, very clear direction in that regard. Kind of hand in hand with knowing your strengths is knowing what your passions are. What is it that you would do? And this is something you can pick up in your discussion groups. What is it that you would do if you had unlimited time and unlimited resources to do it with? On the other hand, you could ask this question: what angers me the most? What do I see that needs to be done as I look around at the state of the world today? What is my holy discontent? A righteous discontent. David had it. God needs a place to live in. I'm going to build him a place because he's worthy of that. Nehemiah said, I have to go and build that wall. I just have to do it. I know that's what I need to do with my life. What would you give the next 12 months of your life to if you had the chance? As you reflect on and endeavour to answer these questions, they will become a good guide to where your passions lie. Participate. Volunteer. Take risks in areas of your strength and passion, but take risks. Sometimes God just looks for the person who says, yep, I'll do it. Doesn't have to be the most gifted or talented person. You don't have to measure up to expectations. Just you're there because you want to serve. That's the kind of heart God is looking for. Isaiah took a risk. He said, I am a man of unclean lips, but God, if you're looking for a volunteer, I'm your man. I heard a voice, the voice of the Lord saying, who shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, here I am. Just send me. Volunteer. Get involved in the programs of the church. Get involved in any kind of group that is doing good in the community. Participate in the Burwood Groups program that is about to be launched in a couple of weeks' time. Get involved and offer to help out in the running of one of those groups. Could be a really easy starting point for you. Look for mentors. Who is Mordecai in your life? You remember what Mordecai was to Esther by way of an advisor and a comfort and a friend. She valued his points of view. She looked to be guided by tap into the wisdom of an older man. So look for mentors, people who can speak into your life, someone willing to speak the truth to you, someone able not just to move you forward, but inward as well. To care, someone who cares about what's happening inside of you as much as they care about your successes and triumphs. One daily practice we can all do is to show kindness. If we get into the habit of showing kindness wherever we go, God sees that and will work through you, because of all of his great qualities, kindness is among the best. It costs nothing to smile. That smile can make a person's day worth living. So a baseline practice that we can all do is just get better at showing kindness. Track yourself throughout the day. How many kind things have I said today? It's just so important that we be ready for that moment when God will cast a vision for our lives. We need to be ready. We need to be prepared. When he asks us to act, we won't be surprised. If we're already in the business, in the habit, in the practice of doing these things, when God casts a vision for our lives, and he will, that we be in a position to receive it. When he asks us to act, we won't be surprised, as others were in the stories we've looked at before. When God shows up in your life and casts a vision for your life, it'll just become a natural extension of what you're already doing. We can all become part of God's plan to redeem the world. And when we do, destinies get formed, a world gets changed, or not. Everybody has a choice. If we don't embrace it, though, if we don't embrace our true mission, then we are all just as likely to pursue something I'm calling our shadow mission this morning. And our shadow mission is just to give in to the temptation to let our lives revolve around things that are unworthy, things that are selfish, things that are more about my comfort, more wealth, just more. I remember reading somewhere a pastor was reflecting on the number of funerals that he had conducted and the number of times that in the eulogy he had been asked to say that the deceased was a very private person. Can you just say they were a very private person? They kept to themselves and they led a quiet life. They didn't hurt anybody, but they just kept to themselves. Yeah, that's the best we can come up with. And he was saying how frustrating he found that to be. His question was to himself, is this the best thing that could be said in summing up a person's life? They were just a quiet person who liked to keep to themselves, very, very private. Those were most likely people on a shadow mission. who lost sight of what they were really here for and here to do. Many of us believe that only a handful get to do anything of value for God and his kingdom. They have the view that only some get chosen, an elite few. The rest of us, poor sods, we're just left to meander or wander through life without any sense of a call. The rest of us, we just get the ordinary life. I'd like to end just with this reminder from the words of Robert F. Kennedy. Let no one be discouraged by the belief that there is nothing that one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice and violence. Few of us will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the events. And in the total of all of those acts will be written the history of this generation. It is from the numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man or a woman stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and bearing, those ripples will build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Your contribution matters. Your part helps. I believe that every one of us is called out to live an original life, a life of influence, a life of purpose. And it's my prayer that you would just rush to embrace that in 2023. Because I think if Moses, Esther, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Daniel, I think if they were here this morning, they would all say it would be the greatest of tragedies if you were to miss it.